The election fraud destroys the definition of democracy. People having no interest in it should have no rights to be citizens of the Republic of Korea. They are only satisfied to live as slaves in the era of Joseon dynasty, not a citizen with freedom. A slave absolutely has no interest in country-wise freedom, but only from his master. I have no intention to force you to believe that it's an election fraud, but to have you look into this in detail as a citizen with freedom, since some suspicions were brought up. I have been living as a dentist over 30 years and I believe in my own way. I have a talent to explain complicated things in a simple way, which is why I decided to make this video. The early voting from the last National Assembly election is the issue in the country. There were many cases that the Conservative Party won the vote on the day, but the party lost the election since they lost big from the early voting. It goes without saying that as the number in the poll gets bigger, the results gets more precise. Apparently it costs more to count the votes and we need to know what number of samples will have confidence. It's unusual, a group of thousands in statistics. For example, a company selling instant general vegetable packs takes a vegetable diet poll every 4 years. The stupid and wicked boss was a friend and a secretary of an ex-boss who committed suicide and he took over the position by accident. A bright but wicked man newly took office as a sales manager and takes a vegetable diet poll. The first poll had the number of 1,000 and the second poll had 2,000, which was taken after 4 days from the first poll. At first, he ran the poll with his trusty followers and the second poll was counted by normal workers. On the first poll, the vegetable diet was 32%. The meat diet was 68%. On the second poll, the vegetable diet was 30% and the meat diet was 70%. The results from the two polls were quite similar. Unless one of the polls was taken at a Buddhist temple, Buddhists do not consume meats. The results should be similar even if they had all 50 million people. The sales manager wanted to use the value from the poll number for advertisement and he decided to manipulate the results. He knew that manipulating the second poll will be discovered as fraud, so he manipulated the first poll since his people counted the number. He managed to fake the results to 50 to 50. It made the total ratio of the vegetable diet turned into 37%. The last National Assembly election held on April 15th was similar to the case. It is clear that the results from the first and the second poll should become more precise and accurate since each constituency is made up of over 10,000 people. Let's watch a video. Dr. Park Sung-hyun, a former professor of Department of Statistics at Seoul National University and president at Hanlimwon. Hanlimwon is known as Korean Academy of Science and Technology, an academy only for the scholars who've had excellent achievements in their field of study. Let's hear his speech just a moment. The difference between the result in the early voting and the vote on the day was huge. This was an enormous gap. When did you get to check it? I was disappointed in the results. I tried not to have interest in it. But people around me kept sending me data to have a look into it since they thought the numbers seemed suspicious. The Korean Central Elections Committee has the data and open to everyone. So I started to look into it, collected more data, and it was actually strange. I was in doubt why the results were suspicious. When is that roughly? The election was over on April 15th, right? It was 2 to 3 days after, April 17th, 18th. Then you saw the results early enough. Yes, I did. People around me already have started to send me data and they thought I might be interested since I'm a statistics professor and they wanted me to analyze it. Professor Kim Min-jeon at Kyunghee University with a bachelor's degree in diplomacy at Seoul National University, PhD in politics at Iowa University. The strange part from the data was extreme difference between the early voting and the on-the-day voting. The candidates of the Democratic Party got 12% more votes on the early voting than the on-the-day voting. The candidates of the conservative got 20% less, 12% less. I question to myself, is this possible? More than 10 times in a day. As I said in the beginning,
네.
the men who run the forensics of elections assume that the elections are random samples. If the samples are considered random,
다치는 거죠. 예.
the bigger the samples, the more similar it would be.
네.
Then how could it have this huge difference? Then how could it have this huge difference when this many people participated in the election? Korean made the miracle on the election again after the miracle of Han River. I can't stop questioning to myself. Let me explain deeper regarding the vegetable poll I mentioned. The first poll showed 32% of vegetable diet and 68% of the meat diet. Therefore, the difference was 36%. The second poll with 30% of vegetable diet and 70% of meat diet tells 40% difference. The difference between the difference of the first and the second poll was 4%, which is 40 minus 36. Do you understand the meaning of the difference of the difference? If you understand the meaning, you will easily understand the explanation that comes next. If you don't get it, take a time to think a bit. It's not difficult. Literally, it's the difference of the difference. Now, if you know, let me keep it going. The 4% is not a big difference unless one of the polls was done at the Buddhist temple. The results should be similar. But a strange phenomenon happened on the 21st National Assembly election. Let's look into it in detail. In a constituency of Jongro District, so-called the number 1 political place, Mr. Lee Nak-yeon, as a candidate of the Democratic Party, competed with Mr. Hwang Kyo-an from the Conservative Party. The early voting showed that the Democratic Party won with 67%. The Conservative Party lost with 33%. The difference was 34%, which is 67 minus 33. The results from the on-the-day voting show that the Democratic Party won by 52% and the Conservative lost with 48%. The difference was 4%, which is 52 minus 48. The difference between the difference of the early voting and difference of the on-the-day voting was 30%, which is 34 minus 4. In a normal election, the difference between the difference of the early voting and the difference of on-the-day voting is usually 1% up to 10%. In some constituencies with a low population, the difference is 10 to 15%. As you can see on the 21st election, there are 4 constituencies over 30% and 29 constituencies over 24% in Seoul. In Gyeonggi Province, 11 constituencies have over 24% of the difference, and many cases found in a whole country. These can never happen. As you can see on the 20th election, there was no such a phenomenon. If we take a look on Dongjak 2 constituency of the 20th election, it's 0.0%. But 21st election shows 27.4%. Songpa 2 data shows 0.1% on the 20th election and 25.5% on the 21st election. Do you know how it's different from 21st election with 30 and 31%? As you can see, Gwangju had no such phenomenon because Gwangju is the hometown of the Democratic Party. In other words, any candidate from the Democratic Party would win, so there was no need of manipulation. Dr. Park Sung-hyun, a former professor at the Department of Statistics of Seoul National University, said this was a masterpiece. Isn't it similar to the vegetable polls results? They came up with 4% before the manipulation and 40% after the manipulation. There are 49 local constituencies and 424 villages in Seoul. National Election Commission has all the data for every village regarding the elections. The rates of votes from the Democratic, Conservative, and other small parties are very similar in 49 local constituencies. I felt strange because I've lived in Yangjae-dong in Seocho District. The local name of a constituency is Seocho District 2. People say that the people in the south of the river, District 3, are relatively more conservative than the others. Then the result should be a bit different from the north of the river district, since the pattern could be different. It is obvious that the results from the south of the river district and the north of the river district should be different. Nevertheless, the result was similar. That is what I meant by feeling strange. It seems like Almighty God made up all the results of the election. Dr. Bain, an American professor at Department of Statistics of Michigan University, has a worldwide authority on the subject of the election fraud. He's become famous for revealing 8 out of 8 election frauds that occurred all over the world. Professor Kim Min-jun at Department of Politics at Kyunghee University, Professor Park Young-ah, and others also mentioned the same as what Professor Park Sung-hyun did. The Democrats alleged that the result like this was shown because a lot of supporters on the Democratic Party joined the early voting. It sounds right when you hear it, but let's verify it by the forensic for the election crimes, like the forensic of DNA investigation for murder crimes. The forensic of election crimes, it sounds difficult, but it's not. It only requires you to understand 8th grade mathematics. The forensic of DNA investigation for murder crimes and the forensic for the election crimes are the same because both of them are scientific investigation. The forensic for murder crimes does a DNA investigation and the forensic for the election crimes does a mathematical investigation. The mathematics is more precise than science, which means that the probabilities of the DNA investigation is 99.99999%, but mathematic investigation is 100%. Even if there was no video on the scene of murder and the evidence like no stabbing knife used for the murder, then the murder becomes substantiated if the DNA investigation was true. Even though there was no video on the scene of the election fraud, it can be proven to be fraud if the mathematic investigation was true. Although it is a matter of democracy's existence, we can't refute back properly, so people on the Democratic Party try to sleep out. There are many dots on the graph. You should understand the correlation which you studied before function in 8th grade, so it should not be difficult. The table is about 10 persons' IQ and mathematics scores. It tells us that a person with low IQ is bad in mathematics. The higher the IQ, the higher the mathematics score. Therefore, there is a relation between the IQs and the mathematics scores. I put every dot of the 10 samples on the graph. Young-hee's IQ is 84 and she got 50 marks. So the dot comes here. Chol-su's IQ is 74 and his score is 5, so the dot comes here. If you look at Nayoung, her IQ is 143 and she got 88, so the dot comes here. As you can see, the dots tend to go upright upward, meaning that there is a relation between IQ and mathematics scores. This table is about other 10 persons' IQ and the lifespan. If you think about the relation between the IQ and the lifespan, a person with low IQ wouldn't die early, vice versa. In other words, IQ and the lifespan are not connected at all. Mr. Bang Man-sik's IQ was 152, which is high enough, but he died early at 25. Maybe he died of a traffic accident. Putting the dots as IQ versus mathematics score on the graph, as you can see, the dots are scattered here and there. Unlike the graph regarding IQ versus mathematics, its tendency is not going up as it goes to the right. It means that there is no relation between them. It's not that difficult. The Democrats allege that the supporters for the Democratic Party joined the early voting in a flock to judge the Conservative Party. As long as there is a judgment theory, the more supporters for the Democratic Party, the higher the rates of the early voting. If there is no judgment theory, even with many supporters for the Democratic Party in a village, the rate of the early voting doesn't necessarily go up because they do not need to join the early voting. With the judgment theory, more supporters will result in higher rate of voting as there is a relation as IQ and mathematics. Then the dots will go up to the right. Let's make a table for the dots of the supporters for the Democratic Party and the rate of early voting as we did for the IQ versus mathematics scores. This table shows the number of supporters for Democratic Party in percentage and the rate of early voting in thousands of villages of 253 constituents all over the country. In Seocho Village 1, the rate of the supporters for the Democratic was 44%. The rate of early voting was 47%. 54% and 36% in Siksa Village, 51% and 54% in Sunchang Village. We are back to the previous graph. This graph shows the dots of the supporters for the Democratic Party in percentage and the rate of the early voting in thousands of villages of 253 constituencies all over the country as the graphs regarding IQ versus mathematics and IQ versus lifespan. The rate of the supporters for the Democratic Party from a constituent of Seocho Village 1 is 44%. The early voting rate is 47%, so the dot comes here. The rate of the supporters in Siksa is 54%, which is here, and the early voting rate is 36%, so the dot comes here. Sunchang Village shows 51% of the supporters, which comes here, and the early voting rate is 54% of the 54%. Let's find out if a huge number of the supporters for the Democratic Party actually casted their votes on the early voting to judge the Conservative Party by analyzing the graph. For the judgment theory to be right, the more supporters for the Democratic Party in a village, the higher the early voting rate, like the graph of IQ versus mathematics score. But it doesn't, right? Rather, the dots tend to go downwards. The early voting rate doesn't go up, right? The early voting rate did not go up, which means that there wasn't a huge number of the supporters on the early voting. In other words, the judgment theory is not true. It's an interesting analysis. The x-axis indicates the rate of the supporters of the Democratic Party. It's a sum of the early voting and the on-the-day voting. It is scattered wide, left from 20% to the right, about 80% depending on the villages in a constituency. Y-axis is the rate of the early voting. If the supporters for the Democratic Party came for the early voting, the rate of supporters should be high. Apparently, it should be high, then it makes sense. In a positive relation, the correlation should show the positive linear relation, but it doesn't. It's a bit negative rather than positive. It should be positive in order to explain that the supporters for the Democratic Party actually came for the early voting. The supporters will make an excuse again. They will say that the rate of the early voting didn't get higher because the supporters for the Conservative Party didn't show up on the early voting, even though the supporters for the Democratic came for the early voting. The graph now you see indicates that supporters from the Conservative Party in red under the same condition. The dots go higher. It means that in a village, as the supporters for the Conservative Party increases, the early voting rate increases. It will be mentioned later, but the Central Election Management Committee reported that the 50s and the 60s participated in the early voting for more than 50%. People aged over 50s support the Conservative Party, therefore the graph makes sense. The tendency should go down if a number of the supporters for the Conservative Party didn't participate in the early voting as they said, so their excuse is false. To see is to believe. The graph tells that their argument is false. This is relation and graph in mathematics in 8th grade. Mathematics is a horrible study. Maybe now you understand why we learn the boring mathematics at school. And you understand the scientific investigation for crimes of election. This is an irrefutable evidence. If there is someone who watched this video and saying that there is no smoking gun, I think he must be airheaded with the IQ of double figures. It's crystal clear that the election is fraud, and I am shocked that they are trying to get away with it. Let me summarize what I've mentioned. Many scholars say that it's strange because it seems that there is a huge difference between the early voting and the on-the-day voting, as if it was an election fraud. Especially Dr. Park, a former professor of Department of Statistics at Seoul National University, a former president at Korean Academy of Science and Technology, said that it seems like a God's work if it is not illegal. As an excuse, they strongly insist that it's not strange since a huge number of the supporters of the Democratic Party casted their votes during the early voting period to judge the Conservative Party. The forensic of a mathematical investigation for the election crimes proved that the supporters for the Democratic didn't come out at all. Therefore, it can only be an election fraud.
People aged over 60s are usually conservative. I checked if the people aged 30 to 40s of the supporters for the Democratic Party came for the early voting. When I looked at the data, it was shown like this. The generation of age over 60s voted the most on the early voting. 3.61 million people were over 60 at the early voting, which is about 32%. 50s is about 21%. Generation of 60s voted the most, then 50s, then 40s. By the way, isn't it general thoughts that people over 60s are conservative and support for the Conservative Party? Then, if you have a look at it, the fact that the Democratic Party won by a landslide is not proven enough. It can't be proved. Actually, I casted a vote on the early voting today. I voted early because the early voting takes 2 days. The on-the-day voting takes only 1 day. But because of COVID-19, I have to wait in line for a long period of time then. I casted a vote on Saturday, the time I felt comfortable, because I didn't like that and I wanted to get it done quickly. When I went there, a lot of old people came out to vote. I asked my friends, they are about my age. Most of them, of course, voted in advance.
In order to understand how the election fraud to work, we must first understand how the counting system is operated. In the past, many people who most of them were teachers counted the ballots by hands and totalized the results. But it took too much time and costed too much labor. As you can see, we developed an electronic sorting machine which recognizes the stamp pad and sort them out within a short period of time. The machine can find the total number of votes, but since there is a possibility of errors or cheating, it only sorts out the votes by parties. In the past, these sorted ballots by parties on a 100 pages basis were checked by turning the pages of ballots carefully whether there are human errors. This process also takes time and not accurate, so the government started using a machine that could count the number of votes and verify the stamp. As you can see, it was modified from the bill counting machine. What you can see is a bill counter, but it's too fast to catch the wrong one if you put ballots in here instead of bills. With some improvement, the bill counter works so fast, but they can still count and check the ballots with their naked eyes. It was not too fast, not too slow, appropriate. To summarize, the sorting machine sorts out the ballots. Then the counting and checking machine is used where man checks the ballots with their own eyes. The machine stops in every set of 100 ballots. When all the sets are combined, it comes up with the results. This election fraud took place in each of the two processes. First, there was an illegal communication device in the sorting machine, which was connected to the server at National Election Commission, and it was linked to the hackers in a computer hacking troop under the Chinese Communist Party, or to the domestic hackers under a Korean hacking troop so-called Through King. It was ordered to send one ballot of the Conservative parties out of 4 ballots to the Democratic parties. Some constituencies had 5. Hacking a device like this with computers is easy that does not require high-skilled programmers. It only needs several lines of code. It's a piece of cake compared to Google's unmanned vehicles parking program or the autopilot program. On the sorting machine, where it goes around like a snake, people can't verify if it's a wrong ballot. But as you can see, it's a bit far away. They can check the wrong ballots if they concentrate where the ballots are piled up. I will explain later why they couldn't catch it. After sorting the ballots, it's a problem that happened on the checking and counting machine. For accurate checking, they must keep their eyes open since the paper drops very fast. As you can see, the 3 men was not looking at the machine. Even those people leave the place after the midnight. I will explain later. Probably in the history of the Korean elections, the early vote has been never counted after the vote on the day. It was crucial that this election had the early voting open after the midnight. When the voting is finished at 6 p.m., it takes about an hour for ballot boxes to arrive at the place of counting, even in Seoul. In the countryside, it takes more time. In the past, the pre-voting boxes in the building arrived first, so it was counted first. This time, Mr. Kwon Sun-il, the chairman of National Election Commission, and Mr. Jo Hye-ju, a standing member, probably ordered to count the pre-voting boxes in the building later. There is no reason to open the pre-voting boxes later because it takes even longer that way. There must be a plot which you will know soon. It was not. If the election monitors continue to work after the midnight, they are paid again. The problem here is that there was no one who supervises the works of the monitors. The system was very loose in terms of the timesheets. After the midnight, the monitors could immediately claim the next day's pay for their works. Many monitors left for their home right after they got paid $50 again when the midnight has passed. I heard a lot of stories. There were a few people in the monitoring room, but pretty much it was empty after the midnight. Can you talk about it in detail? That the vote counting rooms were almost empty as the monitors left for home right after they got paid, which was immediately after the midnight. Mostly the monitors kept their seats before the midnight. In our room, about 60 observers were there in the early night, but only 8 people stayed on their seats until around 3 a.m. Most of the monitors left for their homes after getting their pay for the next day, the early morning after the midnight. I have noticed that most of the observers were disappearing. However, they left very early in the morning and they were paid $50 whether they stay until 2 a.m. up to 8 a.m. However, many monitors left early as the same amount of money was paid regardless of the time they spent for watching the vote counting. Did others leave for home early when they got paid for the next day? Yes, the vote counting for the early voting occurred late in the night. The counting usually occurred after the midnight. At this time, most of the monitors were missing. I think this was a plot managed by National Election Commission. Most monitors left for home early and paid regardless of hours they worked for the next day. You mean that they would remain until the end of vote counting hours if they were paid by the hour. But they were leaving early as they were paid regardless of the total time they stayed and watched the vote counting. They were paid by pre-midnight versus after midnight. Is this correct? The payment rule encouraged them to leave early. Most monitors around me left early. You are correct. Only a few remained on their seats in the early morning, and then 3 or 4 monitors were present. The vote counting in the room was void, even if only one line had no monitors. The vote counting was a part-time job with a daily wage. The counters only want to go home early after wasting their time. 1 minute after the midnight, They were paid another daily wage, $50, and all went home. So there were only a few people sitting in front of the sorting machine and checking and counting machine. They got paid $50 for a minute of labor. Does that make sense? Shouldn't the second day wage be paid in the morning when the counting was over? This is on purpose. And there's a rumor that the Korean Chinese living in Korea who are immigrated from China was hired as the monitors. Eunpyeong district in Seoul already admitted. The man in charge said that the Korean Chinese are rather neutral. What's with the neutral? They are Chinese and they don't have heart for Korea. That's why they leave right after the midnight once they get paid. There are other quite remarkable things. There are several counting tables. Only 2 monitors are allowed per party. Except the Democratic Party and the Conservative Party, the party monitors of small parties were indifferent, so they all went home. The number of the party monitors were insufficient to check them all. At that time, the rally was up and down on TV, which means that their minds were all over the TV to know who would win. In other words, checking the ballots, which is the most important thing, was never done. From 6 p.m. to 12 p.m., there were many monitors and they were not tired so they could check carefully. Because the on-the-day voting was not manipulated and had no errors, they might have thought that the machines make no errors. With that thoughts, people tend not to check the votes accurate enough. It was a clever trick that the early voting was counted later. Mr. Yang Jung-chul, Mr. Lee Gun-hyung, Mr. Kwon Sun-il, Mr. Jo Hae-ju designed these fantastic processes. As in the past, if they counted the early voting first, or they checked the ballots carefully enough, there cannot be cheating on elections. This simple method of counting early voting late led us to the crucial results. We should clarify who ordered this and let them get paid $50 only for a minute. It was an unprecedented trick that the early voting was counted later after the midnight, not recording the monitors' leaving hours intentionally. They worked only 1 minute after the midnight, and they were paid another $50, and they all went back home. With these two combined, proper checking was never done, and the unprecedented event of election fraud happened. You will hear a stupid story. He was a former director of EBS Broadcasting Company and a current Secretary General of a committee of liberal citizens. Not knowing that story about a ballot counting witness mentioned a bit while ago, he talked stupid things through the MIC of pen and mic of 정규제 Broadcasting on YouTube. If you actually go there and see the sorting machine, you can see that the ballots go where it's supposed to go. Normally a ballot marked number 1 goes into the right place of number 1. They say that every 1 ballot per 3 ballots marked as candidate number 2 goes into number 1's place. Oh, never. You will not find one wrong ballot even if you check 1,000 or even 10,000 ballots. If 1 ballot per 3 ballots went into wrong place, anyone would be able to see that. He didn't know that this happened only from 6 p.m. till midnight, which means that only the ballots from on-the-day voting, which is the manipulated, were counted. Because of this kind of man, it becomes even harder to get to the bottom of the truth of the election fraud. As I said in the beginning, if you don't want to live as a slave but a citizen, think in depth and watch the next video if you are interested.